Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church presents Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 5, Sunday, December 29th, 2019. The lesson is entitled, Forsaking All to Follow Him. Lesson text comes from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Related scriptures are John 21, 4 through 8, Exodus 20, 18 through 20, Luke 18, 28 through 30, Matthew 4, 18 through 22. The place is the Sea of Galilee. The time is 27 AD. One of the most horrific and glorious days of my life was the day God introduced me to myself. It was horrific in the sense that I realized for the first time what a filthy sinner I was. When compared to Jesus, I found that there was no comparison. I wanted to go hide somewhere, never to be found again. God would not allow that to happen, however. My sin was not exposed simply to make me feel pathetic and disgusting, but to show me the great need I had for Jesus. This is why it was such a glorious day as well. It was the day my sins were brought to the light. I confessed them and was cleansed of my unrighteousness. 1 John 1:9. Have you ever had such a day? Today's aim, facts. To understand in a greater way who we are and who Jesus is. Principle, to show that Jesus calls all who will believe in him to a life of discipleship. Application, to see how radical a change Jesus will make in the lives of those who will love and follow him. Illustrating the lesson, Jesus called Peter, James, and John to follow him, to be fishers of men. Likewise, he calls us to follow him. Practical points. 1. Jesus brings eternal purpose to our lives. Luke 5, 1 through 2. 2. Jesus wants us to use his people as mediators to reach others. Verse 3. 3. Producing results for Christ often requires us to leave our comfort zone. Verse 4. 4. Through faith, we understand that the limits we impose on ourselves do not apply to God. Verses 5 through 7. 5. Recognizing Christ's true identity humbles us and allows us to trust God more. Verses 8 through 9. 6. As we sacrifice our time and talents to God, he uses us to accomplish things we had never imagined. Verses 10 through 11. Golden text. Why they had brought their ships to land, they forsook all and followed him. Luke 5:1. Today we have 2 lesson outlines. The first is a time to fish, coming from Luke 5:1 through 5. And the second is a time to stop fishing, Luke 5:6 through 11. Introduction. Luke has been very thorough in his explanations of Jesus' preparation for ministry. After the extensive treatment of birth-related material, Luke tells of Jesus' first encounter with the religious leaders when he was 12 years old, 2:41 through 50. The public ministry of John the Baptist, 3:1 through 22, and Satan's grueling temptation of Jesus, 4:1 through 13. Jesus then began to minister in Nazareth and was rejected by his own people, 4:16 through 30. After a time of ministry in Capernaum, verses 31 through 41, he began to preach in the synagogues around Galilee, verses 42 through 44. At that time, his ministry took a turn. He started gathering disciples who would shadow him constantly and become prepared to carry on his ministry after his departure. This was the beginning of Christian discipleship, a model that continues for the church today. Students grow spiritually under mentors until they become teachers of other learners. What a fascinating concept. God uses sinners in the propagation of his gospel. When Jesus chose disciples, he chose men who were markedly imperfect. Time to fish. Luke 5:1. And it came to pass that, as the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God, he stood by the lake of Gennesaret. Verse 2. And saw two ships standing by the lake, but the fishermen were gone out of them and were washing their nets. Verse 3. And he entered into one of the ships, which was Simon's, and prayed him that he would thrust out a line from the land, a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people out of the ship. Verse 4. Now when he had left speaking, he said unto Simon, Launch out into the deep, and let down your nets for a draw. Verse 5. And Simon answering and said unto him, Master, we have toiled all the night, and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. Two empty boats. Luke 5:1-2. Jesus had attracted a lot of attention in the early days of his travels and teachings. As he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, a large crowd of people was pressing hard against him to see and hear him. We know this body of water best as the Sea of Galilee. It is sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias. In the Old Testament, it was known as the Sea of Kinnereth. It lies about 640 feet below sea level. It is approximately 150 feet deep and covers an area measuring 8 by 13 miles. Luke notes that the people who were crowding around Jesus were there to hear the word of God. Verse 1. There was already recognition on the part of many people that Jesus spoke the truth about God, and they were eager to hear more. It seems the crowd was pressing against Jesus so closely that he was about to be pushed into the water. He determined that a change needed to be made in the situation. He noticed two empty fishing boats nearby that were not in use. The fishermen's work was done for the night, and the men were in the process of cleaning their nets in preparation for the next night's fishing expedition. The fishermen are not named yet, but we will meet them soon. The nets were probably bell-shaped with lead weights around the edges. Such a net could be thrown flat onto the surface of the water, and the weights would sink down and cause the net to surround any fish within range. The fishermen could then pull the cord that drew the net around the fish, enabling them to haul their catch to the water's surface into their boat. If the nets were going to continue to be useful, they had to be cleaned regularly and always be free of accumulated weeds. This kind of net also needed to be dried and stretched after each use. If this was not done, it would eventually rot and break. What the fishermen were doing reveals their commitment to their work. And this quality of commitment would certainly be needed for what Jesus had in mind for them. One simple command, Luke 5:3-4. In order to keep from being pushed into the water, Jesus stepped into one of the boats sitting there. It belonged to a man named Simon Peter, who is the main focus of this incident. He was apparently not far from his boat, so Jesus was able to speak to him and request that he move the boat a little ways from shore. Peter was already acquainted with Jesus. Luke 4:38-39 tells us that Jesus had healed his mother-in-law. Jesus often performed acts of compassion as he taught, which added to his reputation as one who wielded divine power and mercy. This event had no doubt made an indelible impression on Peter, so he was certainly not reluctant to allow Jesus to use his boat as he taught the eager crowd of people. Jesus then sat down and began to teach again. In being seated, he assumed the position of a rabbi, making clear that he had the right and authority to instruct these people. We are not told the content of his teaching on this occasion. The focus is more on what he was about to do. Jesus was about to choose his disciples, and they would need to know what he had the right credentials for asking them to follow him. To establish this authority, Jesus gave Peter a simple command. Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draw. Verse 4. The Greek word translated draw is agora and simply refers to a haul of fish. Jesus could have tried explaining who he was to the fishermen, but decided instead to prove himself through a miracle that would get their attention. After this, he would need to say very little about himself because these men would have seen his power firsthand. Jesus was also about to use their own occupation as an object lesson for what he intended them to become. Instead of fishing for men, they would be fishing for people. The miracle would also point out that the kind of fishing he was calling them to was possibly only with his power. One logical objection, Luke 5:5. Peter began his response to Jesus by calling him master. It is the Greek word epistetes, a word that only Luke uses in the New Testament and also from the mouths of the disciples. It refers to a command or teacher. It is obvious from this that Peter had already formed some type of personal relationship with Jesus. He had just heard this rabbi teach and respected him and what he had said. Peter had a small objection, however, that they had worked hard all night at fishing without any results, the implication being that it would be useless to try again, especially after they had their nets all cleaned up. But his respect was such that he was immediately willing to make the attempt. Perhaps he recalled at the moment what had happened with his mother-in-law and recognized that there was something very special and powerful about Jesus that made him worth listening to despite the inconvenience involved. Jesus called for overtime labor in the least productive time of day. Exercising his normal gift of immediate response, Simon Peter protested, "No more fruitless labor for us. We have already done a night's work without anything to show for our efforts." Then Simon caught himself. "You are talking, Jesus. You are the master. What you say we will do." Tough, experienced fishermen let Jesus show them when and where to fish. We have already noted Jesus' willingness to choose and train sinful people for his work. When we reflect on how little we knew about spiritual matters when we were born again, we cannot fail to be grateful for the grace of God. It is also true that when God calls people into ministry, they know very little about what lies ahead for them. He is always patient with us, revealing our sin at the perfect time to lead us to repentance. Romans 2:4. Time to stop fishing. Verse 6. And when they had done this, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. Verse 7. And they beckoned unto their partners, which were in the other ship, that they should come and help them. And they came and filled both the ships, so that they began to sink. Verse 8. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Verse 9. For he was astonished, and all that were with him, at the draw of the fishes which they had taken. Verse 10. And so was also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, which were partners with Simon. And Jesus said unto Simon, "Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men." Verse 11. And when they had brought their ships to land, they forsook all and followed him. Two overflowing boats, Luke 5:6-7. Most fishing was done at night when the fish came to the surface to feed. This is what made nets such an effective means for catching them. During the day they went down to the cooler water in the deep parts of the sea. It was therefore quite illogical for Jesus to ask these fishermen to let down the nets again and expect to catch after having gotten nothing all night. Besides that, they were surely weary after working so hard all night long without success. Humanly speaking, we can well understand their hesitation. These men knew this lake well. They also knew their trade well. They had done everything one should do for catching fish, and there had been no results. Now here comes this carpenter telling them they should move out to deeper water to find fish. Perhaps they had the fleeting thought that maybe he should just stick with his carpentry and leave the fishing to the experts. If they entertained any such thoughts, they did not vocalize it. It is highly probable that even though Peter agreed to do what Jesus said, he was doubtful and did not expect results. He was willing to obey because of his respect for this teacher, but knew that no amount of effort was going to bring fish into the nets at this time of day. He was about to learn, however, that with Jesus, results do not depend on what people know or have experienced in life. That sounds like a lesson every one of us should learn and apply to our own situations. Imagine their shock when they pulled up the nets and they were so full that they were beginning to tear apart. They called for the other men who were in a second boat to help. Soon both boats were so full they began to sink. In that instant, all doubt and reluctance were swept away as these experienced fishermen realized they were in the presence of one more powerful than nature. In Luke 5, 1 through 11, the focus is on Jesus' knowledge that the human condition and the opportunity to share in God's task. Jesus can be trusted. In fact, he knows people better than they know themselves. This is pictured in Jesus' knowing how to fish better than the fishermen do. What they could not do the night before, even though fishing was their profession, Jesus enables them to do with amazing results. One heartfelt response, Luke 5, 8 through 9. With some of Jesus' miracles having to do with nature, there is at least a whiff of explanation. For this miracle, however, we are not given any idea about how Jesus accomplished it. Some therefore speculate that his great knowledge was the deciding factor. He knew where the fish were, unlike the fishermen who had not been able to find them. Others chalk it up to his power. He brought the fish to the location right beneath the boat where they were easily caught. The latter does not seem more likely. What Peter saw, though, was the evidence of the awesome power of God in Jesus. Surely only God could do such a miracle, leading Peter to the conclusion that God was present in Jesus in a unique and powerful way. Peter sensed the very presence of God, causing him to recognize his own sinfulness. As he fell down in front of Jesus' feet, he felt completely unworthy of being in his presence. He begged Jesus to depart. This reminds us of when Isaiah saw God high and lifted up on his throne, Isaiah 6, 1 through 4. All he could say was, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Verse 5. Peter was so astonished by the miracle, as were all the others with him, that all he could recognize was how insignificant he was in comparison to Jesus. There was nothing in him that warranted his being in the same boat with him. He was not fit company for someone like Jesus. It is also possible to conclude from this incident that Jesus cared about the everyday needs of these fishermen. Fishing was their livelihood, and to come up empty meant loss for that day. Jesus took care of that need, and we too can count on him when we suffer need. One simple statement, Luke 5:10 through 11. 4 fishermen are named in these verses, and all of them were astonished by the miracle Jesus performed. Peter was evidently the leader of this group because the others are referred to as his partners. The awesomeness of the miracle must have caused more kind of fearful panic among them too, because Jesus' first words were, "Fear not." He had not performed the miracle to cow them into abject civility. Despite Peter's request, Jesus did not leave. Peter had recognized his sinfulness, and Jesus will never walk away from anyone who reaches this realization. Instead, he will make use of those who realize their dependence upon him. Jesus now saw in Peter exactly what he wanted in his disciples. Everything that had happened led to this moment when Jesus called him into his work. Peter was not the only one called at this time, but Luke's focus is on him. The book of Acts shows that Peter played a pivotal role in the beginning of the spread of the gospel and the establishment and growth of the early church. He soon rose to a role of leadership among the disciples and later wielded decisive and extensive influence in the church that was matched only by the Apostle Paul. Jesus' call was for Peter to leave fishing to seek out other followers of Christ. He and his partners landed their boats on shore, left their occupation behind, and became followers of Jesus for the rest of their lives. Their recognition of Jesus' identity through his miracle changed everything. Questions. 1. Why were people crowding around Jesus? 2. What problem did this cause? 3. What was significant about the fact that Jesus sat down to teach? 4. Why did Jesus command Peter to head for deep water and let down his nets? 5. What was Peter's objection, and why do you suppose he was willing to obey anyway? 6. What made daylight hours an unsuitable time for fishing? 7. What were the astonishing results from their obedience? 8. What was Peter's response to the results? 9. Why do you suppose Jesus had to tell these men to not be afraid? 10. Why did Jesus not heed Peter's request to depart from him? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, December 29th, 2019. Thank you for listening. God bless.